Good morning, everyone. I'm Tim O'Brien. I'm the senior executive editor of Bloomberg Opinion, the commentary arm of Bloomberg News. This is our Tuesday live stream, and this morning, of course, we're going to talk about Iran, Israel, the U.S., war in the Middle East, and the consequences of all of it, and maybe ways of thinking about how to frame your thinking and our own as we move forward through this very complicated time. I'm joined today by two of our columnists, Marc Champion and Hal Brands. Both of them specialize in international affairs. Both of them are smarter than I am, probably smarter than a lot of the people watching, but that's why we're here, to learn from them and to make sense of this. So we'll get started. The Iran confrontation with Israel and then with the U.S. Has blazed by in a series of dramatic and very effective engagements, culminating last night with what appears to be a ceasefire that President Donald Trump engineered in the most personal and private of ways, with just a very few number of players involved. It took some people in the White House by surprise. So Hal, here we are. Israel, since October of 2023, has reordered the military and geopolitical map in the Middle East, and the U.S. has been forced to step in, I think, because of that. Tell me, do you think this ceasefire will hold, and what's your broader sense of what's in front of us going forward?
The ceasefire may hold for a little while, as fragile as it looks right now, but I don't think we should be under any illusion that this is sort of the end of the conflict between Iran on the one side and Israel and the United States on the other. Assuming the Islamic regime in Tehran survives, you're going to continue to have a large country with a lot of potential that is led by a government that is vehemently opposed to an order in the Middle East that has been anchored in American and Israeli power. And so that government is going to try to play the long game and find ways of rebuilding its capabilities and competing for influence in the region again. And so we're going to move into sort of the next phase of this crisis, which I think will be over the question of whether there will be a diplomatic deal that constrains Iran's nuclear program on the back end of military action, but that will be simply one phase of an ongoing competition for influence in the region.
Marc, do you expect Iran, which has been embarrassed, humbled, in many ways almost silenced? The Israelis in the run-up to the U.S. bombing had already taken out Iran's air defenses over Tehran, and jets were flying in and out of Iran at will. Trump is saying publicly that he has wiped out Iran's nuclear program, but there's still, I think it's far too early to actually know that. There's been no inspections. The U.S. has said, specifically Vice President J.D. Vance, that the U.S. doesn't know where Iran's entirety of its uranium stockpiles are. How do you expect Iran to play this, given the position they're in right now?
Well, yes. I mean, we have to recognize that they have been hit really hard by the Israelis with both the Israeli military operation and the American ones, where it's a kind of, operationally perfect, if you like. I mean, just really impressive. So then you kind of move on. The Iranians have clearly understood that there is no upside for them in trying to, escalate and continue this conventional contest with, two of the world's most advanced military powers. They just, it's clear they can't compete, and that's, understood at this point. But, as Hal was saying, there's this is a long game, and in one sense, if you look at the kind of the longer arc, Trump has to fix this because he broke it. There was the end of the nuclear deal, which was designed to limit and constrain and delay Iran's nuclear program. He collapsed that. The result was an expansion destabilization of the whole process, and here we are with airstrikes. Those did really well. Now he's doing the right thing, I think, in trying to get a ceasefire. But what worries me is the language where he says, exactly, it's over. There's no one and done here. I mean, he says that the nuclear program's over. It's been completely destroyed. Well, it doesn't really. It matters, how much has been destroyed in the sense that that will determine how hard it is to rebuild. But in terms of what gets rebuilt and whether this is a resolved issue, that is down to the decisions of the Iranian regime. And as Hal says, there's no reason to think that they have suddenly changed their DNA about foreign policy, their views on the U.S. and Israel, and their goals. So we are in a sense in a very similar position, and we have the same choices to be made about how do you get them to change their minds, how do you get a deal, how do you verify a deal, all these kinds of things. The question in the long term of whether this was a success or not really depends on those things, not the the whiz bang that we've seen, which was incredibly impressive.
I want to claw you back on one thing that you just said. You said that Trump broke this and now he has to fix it. I guess I would take issue with that. In my mind, Hamas broke this in October of 2023. Now, maybe what you would say is we would have ended up here over time anyway. Well, I mean, I should let you say what you want to say.
I think there's
the events that set in motion after October of 2023, when Hamas attacked Israel, and then of course we had Gaza, we had the successful attacks on Hezbollah, then Syria, now Iran. I think all of that got set in motion, obviously, by Hamas's attacks, right?
Well, yes. So the war between Israel and Iran, that was triggered by Hamas, and whatever Iranian role there was in it. But I would say that the question of Iran's nuclear program, and Trump's been very clear before and in his first term, and now that Iran will not have a bomb, and there was always going to be a kind of rubber hits the road moment where he would have to decide, do I do diplomacy and do I use force? He got bounced into force by the Israelis in this case. I can't say whether we would have ended up in exactly this spot otherwise, but I'd say that the nuclear issue was not really contingent on Hamas. That's something that's been going on for a couple of decades.
In that context, Hal, it's it raises a larger kind of global issue about containing nukes in the era we are in. North Korea, which in any other situation would be a minor player in global affairs, has outsized force because it has an actionable inventory of nuclear arms, and that's given its leverage beyond its size and its other influences. Isn't it logical, I guess, for Iran in one way to say they need to double down now on their nuclear program because that's the only leverage they were left with?
I think that's right. And I imagine that there's a certain amount of regret in Tehran right now that Iran tried to sort of sneak out to a bomb as opposed to breaking out to a bomb and just building one and testing it as quickly as possible. Because the lesson that officials in Iran will have drawn, most likely from the last couple of weeks, is that until you have nuclear weapons and people know that you have nuclear weapons, you are catastrophically vulnerable to this sort of conventional strike by superior opponents. And if anything, the value of nuclear weapons may loom larger for officials in Tehran than it did 18 months ago, because the proxy network has been shredded in so many different respects. So, Hamas is a shadow of its former self. Hezbollah was knocked very hard in the war last fall. Even the proxies that are still intact, like the Houthis, seemed less than enthusiastic about coming to Iran's aid in the course of this most recent war. And so if your sort of policy of deterrence vis-a-vis America, and particularly vis-a-vis Israel, rested on two pillars, proxies and then the nuclear program, if the proxies are devalued, you're going to place a higher premium on the nuclear program going forward. Now, the challenge Iran will have to face is that anything they do that looks like it involves restarting the nuclear program or trying to round up the components that are left of it and racing for a bomb is likely to provoke renewed military intervention. And so the question Tehran will have to answer is, what is the timeline on which they think they can reconstitute this? Will they do it in a clandestine fashion as opposed to sort of in a more open fashion? They had been doing it over the past 20 years, albeit with some clandestine components and things of that nature.
But how does, there's yesterday, the Iranians said they now consider the nuclear non-proliferation treaty to be void. It's unclear to me how any inspections would be carried out to assess, independently assess the state of Iran's nuclear program going forward. Do you expect Iran to come back to the table in any way that involves cooperating with the West in a way that allows the West to understand where their nuclear program is going to be?
I think it's a little bit hard to envision at this point. I think that the regime made a strategic decision that it was likely to endanger its own survival if it kept fighting against Israel, and particularly if the fighting with the United States expanded. And this is the sort of pragmatic calculation that the regime has made before at the end of the Iran-Iraq war and after the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003. But sort of signing up to the very intrusive, very strict nuclear deal that I think the Israelis and probably the U.S. would demand at this point might seem to pose a similar threat, just because it would humiliate the regime and raise the question of what all of this expenditure of billions of dollars and trillions in lost economic opportunities was for in the first place. And so I think Iran will be reluctant to engage in anything the U.S. and Israel would consider to be an acceptable nuclear agreement anytime soon, which potentially puts us sort of back to square one, not quite square one, because Iranian capabilities have been so badly degraded, but you'll still be in the position of sort of trying to figure out what the Iranians are up to and holding the threat of military action over their head if they start moving forward on the nuclear file again.
Marc, tell me some further thoughts on what the diplomatic process needs to lock down in the wake of what's occurred over the last 2 weeks. In order to avoid another military confrontation, if that's the goal, and to get back to some semblance of stability.
Marc, it's going to be hot.
Sorry, you were mute for a second.
Sorry, I was muted. Okay.
Yep.
I know I would agree entirely with how it's going to be harder now. It's just, all the optics and so on are going to be harder for the Iranians. So, ironically, you would probably have to offer more now in order to get them to the table to agree to the inspections. I mean, I think the sad irony is that there was a possibility when Witkoff just began the negotiations with the Iranians. There was a way through where you would have had just a much better version of the 2015 deal. And without the sunset clauses and so on, but it would have given them, and with lots of oversight, and it would have left them with civilian only program and so on. I think the Iranians were up for that because of what we're seeing now. They understood that this was a possibility, but for whatever reason, that path wasn't taken, and Witkoff, changed to the sort of zero red line where the Iranians could have nothing. And that was always going to be a non-starter with the Iranians. It still would be a non-starter, I think, for exactly the reasons that Hal gave. That doesn't mean it can't be done in time, but I think, there's going to have to be some sort of, a reset. The Iranians are going to, they've got a lot of wounds to lick at the moment, and they're going to have to. I think there's going to be a period of extreme regime paranoia as they try to, expunge the Israeli intelligence assets that have clearly penetrated, right through the security system there, and they clearly are also going to be thinking about, well, obviously, our air defenses have to be a whole lot better. They're going to be going back. That's where I think the real delays are going to come, because they're not going to. They're going to want to fix all that stuff. The huge holes that they prove to have in their defenses, before they start, thinking about, any sort of work on the nuclear program that might get out and endanger them.
Hal, if Tehran wants to rebuild its air defenses and spend money to build up its conventional defenses, it's going to need money to do that, and it's obviously traditionally gotten its money from oil revenues, and it's one of its leverages has always been its ability to disrupt the Strait of Hormuz and oil flows on tankers through the Strait of Hormuz. Oil prices have gone down in the last few days. There are no indications that Iran wants to disrupt oil flow. It would be shooting itself in its own foot if it were to do so. But do you expect over time that posture might change? That Iran would find it useful if they're cornered enough to try to disrupt oil flows, or is it just so self-abusive that they wouldn't do it?
There are two big problems with closing the strait or impeding traffic in the strait. One is the one that you referenced, which it's the equivalent of choking yourself, given that this is the path through which Iranian oil reaches global markets. But two is that for the past 40 plus years, the United States has made clear that it would regard any effort to interrupt Gulf oil supplies as a threat to its own vital interests, and would potentially use force to roll them back. And this was what led the United States ultimately to get involved in convoying Kuwaiti tankers during the Iran-Iraq war. And I'm sure part of the threat that was conveyed to Tehran after the U.S. strike on the nuclear facilities was that if you do anything like this, we're going to bring a much bigger hammer down on you. And so that doesn't mean it would never happen. What means is that it happens, in my view, only in a scenario when the Iranian regime believes that it is headed for catastrophe one way or another, and is trying to do something, anything, to increase the level of international pain from the conflict to a point that forces everybody to say stop. And I think that those are the circumstances in which it takes that path. I think the Iranians calculated they had an alternative path here, which was to do this sort of demonstrative strike against Qatar, claim that the U.S. attack had been avenged, and then essentially sue for peace. And that was actually the safer route to preserve the regime at this point. But it's not beyond question that they might try something like this in the future.
Mark, do you think, what about terrorism or cyber warfare? Do you expect Iran to sort of pull those levers, or do you think it'll see it in its short-term interest to be more quiescent than that?
So, at this point, I think they've already made that decision. What we saw in Qatar, when they and Iraq, and especially the way that they counted out the missiles that they used, and said we've used exactly the same number of missiles as the Americans dropped bombs on us. That was so clearly an effort to say, okay, we do not want to escalate. Now, any terrorist attacks in the U.S. Or closing the Strait of Hormuz, or any of the other options that they have, so major cyber attacks and so on, anything really big or dramatic that might serve the purpose of showing what they can do, that would sort of undermine their purpose in trying to de-escalate. And it's the same as if you let off a bomb in Chicago, then it's not any different from firing missiles at a U.S. base and killing servicemen. You're going to get the same response from the U.S. So my guess is that again that these are things that they have capabilities for. They've done it in the past, and they would, if we do get into another ramping up and an escalation, then they'll use those tools, because they can't compete conventionally, but they have traditionally been an asymmetric power, and they have used those kinds of asymmetric tools in the past, and they would again. I do think you'll see, less dramatic kind of cyber attacks and so on, the sort of hybrid warfare that has been going on, even before, the last 10 days. So I think you'll see more of that, but nothing that where, there's a big fingerprint on it, a big impact, and then the Iranians would be risking, a full U.S. engagement.
Hell, Israel also has a lot to attend to here. Amid, the successful strikes against Hezbollah, Syria, and Iran, they still have the end results of an aggressive, vicious, and uncompromising war and occupation of Gaza. I had wondered if the U.S. would use the promise of its own involvement in attack on Iran, of an attack on Iran, to extract some sort of a promise from Israel about the future of the Palestinians and Gaza, but things move so quickly, it doesn't appear like anything like that occurred. But where do you think this leaves Israel now, both in terms of its role in the broader Middle East and what it has to do now in Gaza?
So on the Gaza front, I think the reality is that the Trump administration has gotten a little bit frustrated with the whole issue because they have concluded, rightly in my view, that it's just extremely difficult to get a ceasefire due to the political makeup of Bibi Netanyahu's coalition, but also just the essentially zero-sum nature of the contest between Israel and Hamas. And so it's possible you get sort of renewed U.S. diplomatic engagement on this to try to turn the triple you hit with the Iran nuclear attack into the regional home run and to sort of, seal Trump's Nobel Peace Prize and things like that. But I think that's going to remain a very sticky issue. And I think that relates to the second part of your question about is Israel in the Middle East. And so in some sense, Israel is in a better position now than it has ever been. It has rolled back the influence of a number of its enemies. It's broken the ring of fire that Qasem Soleimani liked to say that he had constructed around the Israeli state. It has shown that it can strike with greater force over greater distances than a lot of people realized even after October 7th. But it still has this pervasive grinding insecurity on its borders. And we're seeing that in particularly sort of vivid form in Gaza right now. And the reality is that I don't think anyone in the Israeli political class has really articulated a persuasive end game to how you end the war in Gaza without bringing back either Hamas or the Palestinian Authority, which no Israeli policymaker wants to do at the moment. And so I'm afraid that piece of it looks as uncertain as ever, even as Israel is enjoying the fruits of its triumph over Iran over the past 2 weeks.
Marc, a NATO summit is afoot. Donald Trump will stride into that summit like a colossus. He used U.S. military force in a precise, dramatic, and apparently effective way. Where is Europe left in all of this? As the summit convenes, it's a useful reminder that Europe once obviously was a kingmaker in the Middle East and now appears to be a passive observer.
Yeah, it was, it was nowhere essentially, and that was certainly humiliating to the Europeans. Trump at the G7 meeting, certainly tried to rub that in. I think it is it's a coincidence, right? I don't think anyone was thinking about the NATO summit when any of this stuff was being done in the Middle East. But as he arrives, it is a really dramatic, illustration of the sort of vast gulf in the kinetic capabilities of the U.S. versus the collective non-U.S. NATO. And that's the whole discussion there. They'll get into the sort of spending. They're all trying to please him, to give him the 5% target that he wants, and they'll just hope that they survive the summit and that it doesn't collapse. That nobody sort of puts a spanner in the works, and the alliance survives to fight another day. So it is, the interesting thing is that the Europeans had a place in diplomacy, in enforcing the NPT through diplomacy. They had a place there. There was, if you cast your mind back, the Iranian program was, revealed to the public in 2002, and then you had the Iraq invasion, and then after that, the Europeans got involved. There was the European Three, France, UK, and Germany. Specifically, really, to show that there's another path to dealing with these kinds of issues in the Middle East after Iraq. And they actually, held the ring on, for quite some years. They did a lot of the heavy lifting on the diplomacy. And right up until the 2015 deal, but as soon as diplomacy is abandoned, they're nowhere. They really don't have the tools or the influence to get involved in this kind of hard power resolution.
How Europe's lack of, and to use Marc's great term, it's a lack of a kinetic military capability to make it a player in the ongoing conflict in the Middle East, is even more, I think, existentially revealing and important when you think about the fact that Vladimir Putin is still shelling Kyiv, and there is a very active and hot war in Ukraine with Russia as a strident aggressor. Europe's need to be more kinetic and more militarily potent is highlighted even more there. Russia and China were very much sidelined as well, I think, in this conflict in the Middle East. They don't, appear to be meaningful players right now, but that's not the case in Europe. And will Russia look at what's going on right now in Iran and Gaza as something that's a distraction for the U.S. and benefits Russia because Trump has been very reluctant to come to Ukraine's aid in the same way that he's come to Israel's? What does Europe do with that lesson?
I think from Putin's perspective, it may have looked like he was going to get a certain distraction dividend from this conflict, and it may have looked like he was going to get an oil price bump, particularly when the conflict was really going in the early days. But of course, neither of those things have really materialized, in part because the conflict was so one-sided. And so from Putin's perspective, I think he mostly emerges from this a loser because he's seen one of his strategic partners knocked for a loop. The world has seen
two, really, right? Both Syria and Iran, right?
Yeah, and the world has also seen how little sort of these partnerships between Russia and countries like Iran matter in the crunch, where Russia has done nothing to aid Iran over the course of this conflict. Now, that doesn't necessarily reassure Europe much, because the reality is that Europe has a very long way to go until it can, come close to defending itself without the United States, which is the scenario that every European leader has to have in mind right now. They're already dealing with a pretty aggressive Russian hybrid warfare campaign featuring subversion and sabotage. There are fears about a larger kinetic test if Russia prevails in Ukraine. And so I think that, on the one hand, a lot of European leaders aren't displeased to see the Iranian nuclear program set back. As Marc mentioned, they've been concerned about this for a long time, but that doesn't necessarily alleviate in any meaningful way the more direct military threat that Europe confronts on its own frontiers.
Marc, I want to end with a question for you about both Netanyahu and Trump, we're in the modern era with the idea that, people can't just launch military offensives or play chess or checkers solo. And yet what we're seeing right now is highly individualistic. Netanyahu has established a political coalition in Israel that has allowed him to pursue and prosecute a very aggressive military response to the Hamas attacks. Trump unilaterally, I think maybe only with the involvement of his vice president and secretary of state, launched an aerial bombardment of Iran. So much of this conflict is sort of filtered through these two personalities. Do you think that that's do you think that will be the case going forward, or do you think that's too facile a way of even thinking about some of the terms of engagement right now?
I was really struck that at one point it wasn't just the Europeans who had been sidelined when Netanyahu gave the order to strike in Iran. It was also Trump. The U.S. had been on a different track, and I don't know exactly what the discussions were behind the scenes, but I'd be just given the way that Trump behaved the whole way through, I would be very surprised if this was the outcome that he had wanted, rather than got sort of bumped into by Netanyahu. And so he made the U.S. very relevant again by ordering the airstrikes and getting involved. But that's what's striking to me, was that this is really a display of Israeli hegemony at this point in the Middle East. It is the regional power. Of course, it relies a lot on the U.S., which supports it, supplies it, etc. But that's my sort of takeaway from this, and that the U.S. involvement, in the end, by striking Fordo, is a lesser story, in a way. And the larger one is that it's really Israel that has been deciding, what happens in the Middle East, how the Middle East will be reshaped or not reshaped, and that includes the intransigence that you mentioned over Gaza, so that's what I kind of take away from it.
Hal Brands and Marc Champion, I could have talked to you for another half an hour, but we don't have enough time today. I look forward to talking to you both again. You can find Hal Brands and Marc Champion's work on Bloomberg Opinion on our website. I'm Tim O'Brien. I'm the senior executive editor of Bloomberg Opinion. This has been our politics live stream, and we will be back again next week. Thank you for joining us.